Coming up, the impact of the executive branch.
We're better off if we would have a president who has the ability to manage like a transactional leader and the ability to promote a vision and change like a transformational leader.
Harvard's Joseph Nye discusses the leadership styles of influential American presidents. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome back to this podium a special friend of the Carnegie Council and one whom we greatly admire, Joe Nye. With each presentation, he has taught us something new about the meaning or the use of power, leadership, or the combination of the two. Today, he will be talking about all these concepts and more when he discusses his latest book entitled Presidential Leadership and the Creation of the American Era.
There is a view that leaders perhaps are less important than the larger forces of history. If you remember your reading of War and Peace, you'll of course remember that even with a leader as important as Napoleon, Tolstoy felt it was all the larger forces of history that were driving what was happening in Europe at that time. And I've tried to test this question of do leaders matter, in this case particularly do presidents matter, by looking at the subject that I've been particularly interested in, the rise of American power. And so the question I ask in the book is, if the United States starts out the 20th century as a second-tier power, and it ends up the 20th century as the world's only superpower, did it matter who was president? Would it all have occurred or turned out the same way anyway, or did individual leaders make a big difference? What I try to do to test it is by doing what I call a counterfactual history of the 20th century. A counterfactual meaning that I leave everything the same but change one thing, which is who was president. And imagine that when you have a president who made a crucial decision, you take away that president and substitute for him the next most likely person to be president. And then knowing what you know about that other person and the decisions they would have made, would history have turned out differently or not? But there's a second question that also intrigues me in the book, and that's which kind of presidents? And very often we think of leaders as being at two ends of a spectrum of styles. One end is called transformative leaders. These are leaders with a large vision who want to make major changes in the world, often in inspirational style. And at the other end of the spectrum, we place transactional leaders, leaders who make the trains run on time. They're good managers. They also prevent the trains from derailing. So I looked at these key American presidents who were making decisions related to the various stages of America's expansion of American interest in the world. And I looked at ones who were transformational and transactional, and then asked basically what difference was there between not just whether you had a leader, but what type of leader. And to my considerable interest in terms of what I discovered as I wrote the book, was that about half the leaders mattered and about half didn't, but it wasn't the half that I necessarily would have predicted. It wasn't always the transformational leaders who were the most important. Starting the century, let's think of Teddy Roosevelt. I'll talk about 5 transformational leaders, and then I'll talk about 2 transactional leaders who I think were crucial. Teddy Roosevelt, who's a personal hero of mine, was truly a transformational leader when you look at domestic politics. He made major changes in instituting the progressive movement that basically saved American capitalism, and he certainly earned his place on Mount Rushmore. And in foreign policy, he also did a number of important and impressive things. He helped negotiate the end of the Russo-Japanese War, for which he won a Nobel Prize. He built up the American Navy, the so-called Great White Fleet that he sent around the world. He prepared for the building of a canal across the isthmus. These are big things. But using the high bar that I've set for testing, we'd have to ask if he weren't president, would something like that have happened anyway? And I think the answer is probably yes. This is a period when you had maximum growth in the American economy in terms of America surpassing Britain and other European countries. The Americans had the full wind in their sails, if you like. So there's a transformational leader, very important leader, but who I would argue wasn't crucial to the way history unfolded. Now, Roosevelt was followed by Taft, obviously, but after that by another transformational leader, also part of the progressive movement, Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, when he comes into office, is basically focused on domestic politics. He doesn't have a foreign policy vision. He indeed spends much of his first term in office trying to stay out of the war in Europe, 1914. And he runs for office in 1916 on the promise that he's kept us out of war and therefore will continue to keep us out of war. But then Germany recommences unrestricted submarine warfare, starts sinking ships, both American and British, loss of American lives, and they also begin to meddle a bit in the Western Hemisphere with the famous or infamous Zimmerman telegram relating to Mexico. And Wilson realizes that the policy that he's pursued for 4 years, which is try to mediate the war, stay out of the war, and so forth, is not going to work. And he has three major options. One option is let the status quo continue, which he doesn't feel is tenable because of the new German actions. Second is what's called armed neutrality. You stay out of the war, but you arm American ships to try to do something about the U-boats. And the third is to reverse a major tenet of American foreign policy, which is no entangling alliances, stay within the Western Hemisphere, stay out of Europe. And he decides to call for sending a massive American army to Europe. Big, big change, transformational change in American foreign policy. Now, you could say, okay, but if it hadn't been for Wilson, would we have gone into World War I? Probably yes. If Teddy Roosevelt had been elected in 1912, he probably would have taken us into World War I, probably even sooner than Wilson did. Teddy Roosevelt believed that in terms of the balance of power, that it was essential that the Americans came in on the side of the Allies. That if Germany won in the long run, it would be more dangerous to our interests. So Wilson takes a transformational move, but Roosevelt would have also. The big difference, and the reason that Wilson makes such a difference, was not that he took us into the war, but how he explained it and what his ambitions were. If Roosevelt had taken us into the war, he would have said for balance of power. Wilson hated the balance of power. He thought it was immoral. Said this is the way big countries treat little countries like cheeses to be cut up for their convenience. And he said we have to change the way world politics is done. We're going to replace the balance of power with collective security, which means that instead of a balancing of power, all the good countries will unite against the aggressor country, and that will essentially create world peace. This doctrine of collective security, which he starts with his 14 points and then negotiates at Versailles and is encompassed in the Covenant of the League of Nations, which is part of the Treaty of Versailles, he brings back to the American Senate. And Henry Cabot Lodge, the senator from Massachusetts, basically says, no, there have to be a few amendments to protect American sovereignty. Wilson says, you can't touch my treaty. You have to leave it just the way it's negotiated, even though we now know that some of the allies said they would have tolerated some changes. And rather than compromise with the Senate, where moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats would have formed a majority, He tells the Democrats not to do anything. He goes on a whistle-stop tour of the western United States, trying to persuade public opinion that they should have the Treaty of Versailles passed just as it's written. During that tour of the West, he suffers a stroke. The stroke debilitates him, not kills him. He comes back to the White House a very sick and embittered man. And when the Democratic leadership in the Senate says to him, "Can we compromise on this treaty now?" he says, "Absolutely not." So there is no compromise. As a result of that, the United States does not join the League of Nations. One of the great ironies of history is that if Wilson's stroke had killed him rather than debilitated him, the United States probably would have joined the League of Nations. But the net effect of Wilson's transformational action was by promising not merely to change American foreign policy, sending troops to Europe, but to try to change the world as well, the whole way world politics was organized. He actually led to the extreme isolationism of the 1930s. In other words, the American reaction over time to Wilson's great promises and the feeling that we'd been deceived led to an intense reaction, so that by the 1930s, you have 70% people answering polls saying, "Stay out of Europe, stay out of another war." So that brings me to the third transformational president who was crucial, which was Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt comes into office in 1933 without any foreign policy agenda. He's focused properly on the Depression. He's thinking of domestic politics. And that's true in the election of 1936 as well. Roosevelt changes his view in 1938 after the Munich Agreement and Kristallnacht in Germany. And he decides that Hitler is going to be a threat to the United States, and that the United States is going to have to do something about Hitler, and that's going to get us involved in Europe. But every time he gently tries to persuade people of that or give a speech that hints at it, like his famous quarantine speech about the Spanish Civil War, he gets intense reaction from the body politic. And he always draws back very quickly. So Roosevelt tries to engineer some things which will get the Americans into the war. For example, there's a famous incident in which an American destroyer, the Greer, has an encounter with a German U-boat. And Roosevelt says to the American people something that was a complete lie. The U-boat attacked the Greer. In fact, we know now that the Greer fired first. But even that's not enough to get the Americans to change their position. So what Roosevelt does is he makes preparations for the circumstances in which public opinion may change. So we institute a draft. We begin to build defense spending. We have Lend-Lease to Britain to help Britain stay alive. In those circumstances, then, Roosevelt, having failed in all his efforts to get us into World War II, Roosevelt is saved by the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's arguable that if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt could not have gotten the Americans into World War II in Europe. And then you could say, well, wait a minute, you've just said Roosevelt was important, but here's a man who couldn't accomplish what he set out to do, and he basically accomplished it by accident. Then how do you call him important? And let me give you an example with my counterfactual exercise. Imagine that, as Philip Roth speculates in his novel, The Plot Against America, imagine that in 1940, the Republican Party had nominated Charles Lindbergh instead of Wendell Willkie, an internationalist. Lindbergh was a staunch isolationist and an admirer of Germany. And imagine that you'd had that type of president, President Lindbergh, when Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor. Would it have made a difference? I think probably yes. First of all, you might not have had Pearl Harbor, but if you had Pearl Harbor, you'd have seen American policy that focused on the Pacific, not on Europe. And if that had occurred, the world in 1945 might have been not bipolar with the U.S. and Soviet Union as the grand superpower survivors of the war, but with a Europe that was divided between Stalin and Hitler, communists and fascists, with the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere and Japan with its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, you would have seen a multipolar world, and perhaps a quite violent multipolar world. Of the transformational presidents, let me mention Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is often credited with ending the Cold War.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In fact, he did play a useful role, but the person who deserves most credit for ending the Cold War, the truly transformational leader, was Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev wanted to transform the Soviet Union to save it. He was a reformer. Perestroika was a restructuring. When that didn't work, he tried glasnost, which is opening up to light a fire under the bureaucrats. But when you asked people what they wanted out. Where Reagan deserves credit is not just the defense buildup that put pressure on the Soviets, but was Reagan's sense of compromise. Very often people look at Reagan and they say, well, a Reaganite foreign policy is just to be tough. Reagan was much more subtle than that. He knew that you could talk tough, but then you bargained. And when he went to the Geneva summit in 1985 and decided as he looked at Gorbachev, I can do a deal with this man, that was a very important point. So I think Reagan does get credit, but again, not the credit that's often given that Mr. Gorbachev tear down the wall ended it, rather Reagan's sense of how to bargain and intuiting that Gorbachev could be worked with. So those are the transformational leaders that made a big difference in America, the expansion of the American era. But I mentioned that I was also impressed by some of the transactional leaders, two in particular, Dwight Eisenhower and the first Bush, George H.W. Bush. It turns out, as I look back over this history, they were as important as these much more flamboyant transformational leaders. Let me tell you why. In 1955, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff came to Eisenhower and said, we're going to have to use nuclear weapons against China. We can't defend these offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu, which are right on the shoreline of China, because China has conventional superiority there. And so we're going to have to use nuclear weapons, and we recommend it. Eisenhower's comment was, my God, you boys must be crazy. We can't use those awful things against Asians again within 10 years. That's an extraordinary decision. Imagine that instead of Eisenhower, another World War II general who wanted to be president, Douglas MacArthur, had been president, we would have used the weapons. Indeed, MacArthur recommended in 1950 that Truman use nuclear weapons in Korea. The fact that Eisenhower said no means that the world today is very different than if nuclear weapons were used as normal weapons of war. And that I'll conclude from that with George H.W. Bush, Bush 41. Bush 41 used to say famously, I don't do the vision thing. He had been Reagan's vice president. He knew he couldn't compete with Reagan in terms of rhetoric. He felt awkward at trying to give these very dramatic type speeches that Reagan gave. And so he explicitly avoided it. In November of 1989, when the Berlin Wall comes down, it's a cause for great jubilation. And many of Bush's advisors come to him and they say, we have to make political capital out of this. Bush's response was, no, I'm not going to dance on the wall. I'm not going to gloat and isolate Gorbachev. Instead, a month later, he met with Gorbachev at the summit in Malta and began a process which oversaw one of those remarkable changes in the history of the 20th century, which is a Germany and Europe divided by a Berlin Wall and an Iron Curtain with 400,000 heavily armed Soviet troops in East Germany. From that picture in 1989 to 2 years later, a Germany which was reunified inside NATO without a shot being fired was a truly dramatic change. Most people thought it couldn't be done. Margaret Thatcher opposed it. Brent Scowcroft initially opposed it. And yet Bush presided over this by just very careful, low-keyed management. And in that sense, I think the two leaders, transactional leaders, Eisenhower and Bush, they weren't flashy, they weren't transformational in their objectives, but they were extremely good managers. They had what I call contextual intelligence, which is they had a background and knowledge which allowed them to understand how foreign policy really works. And foreign policy is particularly complex as an area for leaders to make decisions because it involves not merely understanding the distribution of power and the different cultures of a number of different countries, but how they interact with each other as an international system. And in that kind of complexity, it's extremely important that a leader have contextual intelligence. In that sense, it's interesting comparing the two Presidents Bush. George W. Bush, Bush 43, came into office not interested in foreign policy. You remember the 2000 campaign had almost no foreign policy in it. But he was transformed as the country was transformed by 9/11. And he developed a vision which was to get at the roots of terrorism in the Middle East by overthrowing Saddam Hussein and creating a democracy in Iraq, which would then spread throughout the region. Alas, he was unable to implement the vision, a little bit like Woodrow Wilson with too ambitious a vision, which fails. His failure, I think, set things back. I suppose the moral of this story would be that we're better off if we would have a president who has the ability to manage like a transactional leader and the ability to promote a vision and change like a transformational leader, and perhaps sometime in the future some genetic engineer will find out how to produce that kind of leader. What we do know is, comparing the two Bushes who shared half their genes, that thus far nature hasn't solved the problem. So thank you very much.
There are two pure counterfactuals by your criterion of who else would have been president that you didn't discuss. One of them was Kennedy versus Nixon, and the other one was Bush versus Gore. So could you tell us a little bit about those two?
With Bush versus Gore, I have 500 votes have been counted differently in Florida in 2000. I think President Gore would have responded by sending Americans to Afghanistan. I don't think we would have had the invasion of Iraq. So that counterfactual, I think, would make a big difference. On Nixon, if Nixon had defeated Kennedy in 1960, it's a very hard one to answer because Kennedy only got 3 years. So we're judging sort of in mid-course, and we don't know how he would have acted. I don't know whether Nixon would have made the same bets and same mistakes on Vietnam that Kennedy made. Kennedy's first year was not a great success. He had the Bay of Pigs. He had the meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna, which helped to heighten the Berlin crisis. And then he moved on from that to, Kennedy did a lot of good things, but he made some mistakes. He moved on to that, to increasing our involvement in Vietnam. Some people have written books saying that Kennedy would have, if he'd been reelected, would have pulled out of Vietnam. Others dispute that, but we really won't know. So it's a hard counterfactual to work out because it's a presidency interrupted prematurely. What we do know is that in coming into office, Nixon would have had much more experience than Kennedy, and perhaps might have avoided some of the mistakes of Kennedy's first year.
I'm surprised that you didn't define Richard Nixon as a transformational president, given what he did with China. On the long-term perspective, don't you think that was a major event?
In the book, I do describe Nixon's opening of China as a transformational move, very important one. Nixon had the sense to take the Vietnam experience, which was very negative experience for the United States, and more or less, you might call it, change the channel. I mean, by getting a focus on China and Russia, China, it took us out of this mess in Vietnam. The reason I didn't discuss it this morning, though I do mention it in the book, is I think the Vietnam experience as a whole set back rather than advanced the creation of the American era. A little bit like Woodrow Wilson's efforts set us back. It's also worth remembering that Nixon believed that the world was already becoming multipolar. He thought the United States, he and Kissinger both wrote the United States is declining, the world is going to be multipolar. The argument that the Soviet Union was about to vanish and the world was going to be unipolar never crossed his mind. Didn't cross many people's minds either. So I give Nixon a lot of credit for what he did. And we should also remember something else, that another foreign policy decision that Nixon made was to destroy the Bretton Woods monetary system, take away the convertibility of the dollar into gold, which unleashed a terrible inflation which plagued his successors, Ford and Carter, and antagonized his allies. So he did some things right. He did some others that weren't so great.
Well, thank you for taking us on this wonderful journey this morning. It was truly wonderful. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.